In the harsh lands of Wyoming Territory, 1875, they say the most dangerous men aren't the ones wearing stars on their chests or notches on their guns. They're the quiet ones who've seen enough killing to know the true cost of violence. And in the dusty streets of Shadow Valley, that old wisdom was about to prove truer than anyone could have imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Shadow Valley barely deserved its name in the spring of 1875. Nestled between towering peaks and endless prairie, it was little more than a collection of weather-beaten buildings struggling to survive along the banks of a meandering river. The town's lifeblood flowed through its modest establishments: Lancaster's General Store, the well-worn Silver Dollar Saloon, a whitewashed church whose steeple listed slightly to the west, and a scatter of determined homesteads stretching out into the surrounding valley. Emma Lancaster had run the general store since her husband's passing 3 years ago, and she'd learned to read more than just ledger books in that time. She'd learned to read people, to see the stories written in the way they held themselves, in the shadows behind their eyes. That's why the old man who walked into her store one crisp March morning caught her attention in a way few others had. He led a paint horse, its saddlebags heavy with basic supplies. Nothing unusual there. Plenty of aging cowboys had passed through Shadow Valley, their best years behind them. But there was something about this one that made Emma's carefully honed instincts stir. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, dressed in faded denims and a worn leather vest that had seen better days. His face was weathered by sun and time, partially hidden beneath a gray beard. But his eyes, those eyes made Emma pause in her sweeping. They were the kind of eyes that had seen too much, the sort that took in everything while revealing nothing. They swept the store in one practiced glance, noting every exit, every angle, every possible position of advantage. Those weren't a retired cowhand's eyes. "Name's William Hawkins," he said, his voice as dry as prairie grass. "Looking to buy some supplies?" His hands moved with unusual grace as he selected basic provisions, each motion precise, controlled. These weren't just a cowboy's hands, despite the working man's calluses she could see on them. "Planning to stay long?" Emma asked, measuring out coffee beans with practiced care. The valley had seen its share of drifters, each bringing their own brand of trouble. "Bought the old Mackenzie place," Hawkins replied, referring to a small ranch north of town that is considered too close to Snake River gang territory to work safely. "Good grazing land, quiet spot for a man to spend his later years." Emma watched him count out silver dollars with those two graceful hands. "Mackenzie left because of the raids," she said carefully. "Snake River gang isn't known for leaving peaceful." "Folk in peace." Hawkins' smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Trouble has a way of finding everyone, Mrs. Lancaster. The question is whether you're ready when it comes." Young Sam Lancaster, Emma's 12-year-old son, had been watching the exchange with keen interest. Something about the old man had captured his attention, maybe the way he moved, like a mountain lion pretending to be an old house cat, or how he seemed to know exactly where everyone in the store was without looking directly at them. "Need help carrying anything to your horse, mister?" Sam offered, eager to learn more about the mysterious newcomer. "Appreciate the offer, son," Hawkins replied, "but I prefer to handle my own burdens." He paused, studying the boy with those sharp eyes. "Though if you're interested in learning something useful, I could use help with the horses once I get settled. Your mother permitting, of course." Emma hesitated. Her motherly instincts warned her about letting Sam get too close to a stranger with such carefully hidden depths. But something in Hawkins' manner, the gentle way he spoke to her son while still showing proper respect for her authority, made her reconsider. "We'll see," she said finally, "once you're settled in." Hawkins tipped his hat and left, leading his paint horse toward the northern edge of town. Emma watched him go, noting how he automatically kept the setting sun at his back, Another small detail that seemed out of place for a simple, aging cowboy looking for a quiet place to retire. Doc Harrison stepped into the store just as Hawkins disappeared from view. "Saw we had a newcomer," he said, his wise old eyes twinkling. "Interesting fellow." "More than interesting," Emma replied. "Did you notice how he moves?" "Like a man who spent a lifetime being ready," Doc nodded. "Reminds me of stories I heard back east about a lawman they used to call." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But that was long ago, and Shadow Valley's got enough troubles without digging up old legends." As the sun set over Shadow Valley, painting the western peaks in shades of blood and gold, none of them could have known that they'd just met a man whose quiet reputation was about to become their only hope against the storm gathering on the horizon. The next few weeks saw William Hawkins working his newly purchased ranch with methodical precision. From dawn until dusk, he could be found mending fences, tending to his small herd of horses, and making repairs to the old Mackenzie homestead. But young Sam Lancaster, who had taken to watching the old man from the cover of nearby ridges, noticed things others might miss, like how Hawkins would sometimes pause in his work, head cocked slightly as though listening for something beyond normal hearing. Or how his hands would occasionally drift to his right hip, where no gun hung, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his appearance as a simple, aging rancher. But what truly caught Sam's attention was what happened one morning when he'd crept closer than usual to watch Hawkins break a particularly spirited Mustang. The horse, a magnificent black stallion, had been giving Hawkins trouble all morning. As the old man worked with the animal, Sam noticed something extraordinary in his movements, a patience and precision that spoke of years of experience. But it wasn't just his horsemanship that caught the boy's eye. When the stallion suddenly reared, nearly trampling Hawkins, the old man's reaction defied belief. Without seeming to look, without even changing expression, Hawkins moved like lightning. One moment he was in the path of flailing hooves, the next he had sidestepped with impossible grace, one hand catching the horse's bridle, while the other stroked its neck soothingly. It was the kind of move that shouldn't have been possible for a man half his age. Too fast, too precise, like his body knew where it needed to be before his mind gave the command. Sam scurried home that day, his young mind racing with questions about the mysterious old cowboy who moved like no retired rancher he'd ever seen. But Shadow Valley held deeper secrets than just the identity of one unusual newcomer. The peace that gave the town its seeming tranquility wasn't just fragile. It was an illusion. The Snake River Gang, led by the notorious Victor Viper Reeves, had been pushing their territory further north, squeezing honest ranchers dry through a combination of terror and ruthless efficiency. They'd already taken control of 3 valleys to the south, using methods that made even hardened frontiersmen blanch. Their pattern was always the same. First came the accidents, cattle found dead at waterholes, mysterious fires in the night, fences cut and horses scattered. Then would come the offers to buy, always well below fair value. Those who refused found themselves facing escalating violence until they either sold out or ended up dead, their land seized through forged documents and corrupt officials. Emma Lancaster knew their methods all too well. Her husband had been one of the first to stand against them, organizing resistance among the local ranchers. They found him one morning behind his own store, shot through both knees before the killing shot, his wedding ring replaced with a rattlesnake's rattle, Viper's calling card. As spring deepened into summer, word of the gang's approach spread through Shadow Valley like wildfire in dry grass. Most folks paid little mind to William Hawkins during these tense days. He was just another aging cowboy trying to make a living from stubborn earth, no different from the others who worked the valley's scattered ranches. But Sheriff Marcus Cole, watching from his office with growing concern, noticed things others missed. Like how Hawkins seemed to know exactly when riders were approaching town, often appearing at the Silver Dollar Saloon moments before trouble arrived. Or how he had quietly but firmly established relationships with key members of the community. Doc Harrison, Reverend Walsh, even old Jake Thompson at the livery stable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and rose, Cole decided it was time to have a word with the mysterious newcomer. He found Hawkins at his ranch, carefully checking his horses before nightfall. "Mighty fine animals you've got there, Mr. Hawkins," Cole commented, watching how the old man's hands moved with fluid efficiency despite their apparent age. "Don't believe I've ever seen stock quite so carefully chosen." Hawkins didn't look up from his work, but something in his posture shifted slightly. "Good horses make good neighbors, Sheriff. A man ought to be particular about what he chooses to rely on." Cole shifted in his saddle, choosing his next words carefully. "Been hearing interesting stories about you. The Lancaster boy says he saw you move faster than a striking rattler when that black stallion tried to brain you. That's quite a feat for a man looking to retire quietly. Sam has quite an imagination," Hawkins replied mildly, but his hands had stilled on the horse's bridle. "Though sometimes a man needs to move quickly, regardless of his age." "Indeed," Cole agreed, then added quietly, "just like sometimes a lawman needs to know who's really settling in his town, particularly with trouble riding up from the south." This time, Hawkins did look up, and Cole felt the full weight of those measuring eyes. "Seems to me, Sheriff, that a man's past is his own business, as long as he tends his stock and pays his taxes. Under normal circumstances, I'd agree, but with Viper Reeves pushing north, circumstances are far from normal." Cole paused, then added carefully, "I knew a lawman once, during my younger days. They called him the Ghost of Laramie, not because he killed men, but because he had a way of appearing exactly where trouble was brewing, always one step ahead of the violence. Never did learn his real name." Hawkins had returned to his work, his movements as precise as ever. "Interesting story, Sheriff, but I'm just an old cowboy trying to find some peace in my later years." "Of course you are," Cole said, turning his horse to leave. "Just like I'm just a simple lawman trying to protect his town. But if you were something more, say, a man who might understand what we're really up against, I'd sleep better knowing you were here preparing for what's coming." The first real signs of trouble came to Shadow Valley on a Tuesday morning, riding in with the dawn. 3 men, dusty from the trail but wearing clothes too fine for common drifters, walked into Lancaster's general store just as Emma was opening. Up, their gun belts rode low, tied down for fast draws, and their eyes held the cold calculation of men measuring everything in terms of profit and violence. "Fine establishment you have here, ma'am," the leader said, his voice carrying a false sweetness that set Emma's nerves on edge. "Name's Cole Watson. My associates and I represent certain business interests looking to invest in promising locations." Emma continued arranging her shelves, keeping her movements calm despite the tension building in her store. "Shadow Valley's just a small ranching town, Mr. Watson. Not much here to interest outside investors." Watson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I wouldn't say that. Good grazing land's worth more than gold these days. Speaking of which, we heard you might know something about local property values, being a prominent business owner and all." Before Emma could respond, the store's bell chimed. William Hawkins walked in, leading his paint horse for his regular supply run. He moved with that same quiet grace, seemingly absorbed in his own thoughts. But Emma noticed how he positioned himself with clear sightlines to all 3 visitors. Watson's hand drifted casually closer to his gun. "Don't believe we've met, friend. Just having a friendly conversation about local business opportunities." "Daniel Hawkins," came the soft reply. "Just an old cowboy trying to make ends meet." He began selecting his supplies with unhurried precision, but Emma saw how his movements kept him in perfect position to react if needed. "Cowboy, eh?" Watson's voice held thinly veiled contempt. "Must be tough working land out here. especially with all the accidents that seem to happen to folks who don't understand the changing times. Hawkins paused in his shopping, studying a can of coffee with careful attention. "Funny thing about accidents," he said mildly. "They tend to happen most often to people who aren't paying proper attention to their surroundings." The threat, subtle as a whisper but sharp as a knife's edge, hung in the air. Watson's face darkened, but before he could respond, Sheriff Cole appeared in the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. "Gentlemen," Cole said carefully, "I wouldn't want any accidents in Mrs. Lancaster's store. Bad for business, you understand." Watson forced his smile back into place. "Of course, Sheriff. Just having a friendly chat about local opportunities. In fact, we were just leaving." He tipped his hat to Emma with exaggerated courtesy. "We'll be seeing you again, ma'am. Count on it." After they left, Cole turned to Hawkins. "Those were Reeves's men. Scouts, testing our defenses, measuring our resolve." "Figured as much," Hawkins replied, continuing his shopping with the same careful precision. "They'll be back, probably within the week. Next time with a proper offer backed by proper threats." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped Hawkins's purchases. "They're going to try to force us to sell, aren't they? Just like they did to Tom." "Most likely," Hawkins replied, his voice remaining calm, but there was steel beneath the softness. "But there's something they don't understand about this valley, something that makes it different from the others they've taken." "And what's that?" Cole asked. Hawkins's smile was ghost quiet. "They're used to dealing with scattered ranches, isolated homesteads, easy to pick off one by one. But a community that stands together, that's something else entirely." That evening, Sam Lancaster made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been checking the back creek that ran behind Hawkins' property, looking for good fishing spots, when he found something that made his blood run cold. 3 dead cattle, their bodies hidden in a thicket, each bearing the distinctive snakehead brand of Reeves's ranch. But it was how they died that told the real story. These weren't animals that had wandered off and died naturally. Each had been killed with surgical precision, quick, clean cuts that would have dropped them instantly, designed to look like mountain lion attacks to the untrained eye. Sam ran all the way back to town, bursting into Doc Harrison's office where he knew his mother was having tea with Clara Harrison. "Ma! Doc! They're starting! Just like before with Pa!" But when they rode out to show Sheriff Cole the evidence, they found Hawkins already there, examining the scene with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. He moved through the area with practiced efficiency, noting details others might have missed. "Look. Here," he said, pointing to marks in the soft creek bank. 3 men, riding double-shod horses, came in before dawn, left within the hour. His fingers traced marks in the dirt that most would have overlooked. "They're sending a message, but not just about the cattle." Doc Harrison, who'd insisted on coming along, knelt to examine one of the carcasses. "These cuts, they're too precise. For random violence, someone wants us to know they can strike anywhere, anytime." "That's not all they're telling us," Hawkins replied, those weathered hands moving over the ground with practiced care. "These tracks, the timing, the placement, they're not just killing cattle. They're testing responses, learning patterns, seeing how we react to threats." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Just like they did before with Tom, they're starting their pattern all over again. Hawkins straightened, brushing dirt from his hands with deliberate care. "Maybe. But patterns work both ways. Sometimes knowing your enemy's habits is better than knowing their numbers." He turned to Sam, his voice taking on that teaching tone the boy had come to know. "Remember what I told you about breaking that black stallion? About how understanding an animal's patterns is more important than raw strength?" Sam nodded eagerly. "You said every creature has its ways, and once you know them, you can predict what they'll do next." After they left, Cole turned to Hawkins. "Those were Reeves's men. Scouts, testing our defenses, measuring our resolve." "Figured as much," Hawkins replied, continuing his shopping with the same careful precision. "They'll be back, probably within the week. Next time with a proper offer backed by proper threats. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped Hawkins's purchases. They're going to try to force us to sell, aren't they? Just like they did to Tom. Most likely, Hawkins replied, his voice remaining calm, but there was steel beneath the softness. But there's something they don't understand about this valley, something that makes it different from the others they've taken. And what's that? Cole asked. Hawkins's smile was ghost quiet. They're used to dealing with scattered ranches, isolated homesteads, easy to pick off one by one. But a community that stands together, that's something else entirely. That evening, Sam Lancaster made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been checking the back creek that ran behind Hawkins' property, looking for good fishing spots, when he found something that made his blood run cold. 3 dead cattle, their bodies hidden in a thicket, each bearing the distinctive snakehead brand of Reeves's ranch. But it was how they died that told the real story. These weren't animals that had wandered off and died naturally. Each had been killed with surgical precision, quick, clean cuts that would have dropped them instantly, designed to look like mountain lion attacks to the untrained eye. Sam ran all the way back to town, bursting into Doc Harrison's office where he knew his mother was having tea with Clara Harrison. "Ma! Doc! They're starting! Just like before with Pa!" But when they rode out to show Sheriff Cole the evidence, they found Hawkins already there, examining the scene with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. He moved through the area with practiced efficiency, noting details others might have missed. "Look. Here," he said, pointing to marks in the soft creek bank. 3 men, riding double-shod horses, came in before dawn, left within the hour. His fingers traced marks in the dirt that most would have overlooked. They're sending a message, but not just about the cattle. Doc Harrison, who'd insisted on coming along, knelt to examine one of the carcasses. "These cuts, they're too precise. For random violence, someone wants us to know they can strike anywhere, anytime." "That's not all they're telling us," Hawkins replied, those weathered hands moving over the ground with practiced care. "These tracks, the timing, the placement, they're not just killing cattle. They're testing responses, learning patterns, seeing how we react to threats." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Just like they did before with Tom, they're starting their pattern all over again. Hawkins straightened, brushing dirt from his hands with deliberate care. "Maybe. But patterns work both ways. Sometimes knowing your enemy's habits is better than knowing their numbers." He turned to Sam, his voice taking on that teaching tone the boy had come to know. "Remember what I told you about breaking that black stallion? About how understanding an animal's patterns is more important than raw strength?" Sam nodded eagerly. "You said every creature has its ways, and once you know them, you can predict what they'll do next." Hawkins knelt down to the boy's level, his voice gentle but serious. "Sam, let me tell you something important. A man's not just one thing. Maybe I learned some skills in my younger days that weren't about ranching, but what matters isn't what a man can do with a gun. It's what he chooses to do with his knowledge, his experience." He stood, addressing both Emma and Cole now. "The Snake River gang thinks they're riding into another easy victory. They expect to find scared ranchers and shopkeepers ready to break at the first sign of violence. Instead, they're going to learn that sometimes the strongest weapon isn't the gun in your hand, but the ground beneath your feet and the people standing beside you." As they rode back to town, more details emerged about the gang's approach. They weren't just bringing guns and numbers. They were bringing a reputation that had broken the spirit of 3 other valleys. Victor Reeves had turned terror into an art form, using a combination of violence, intimidation, and corrupt officials to build his empire. But something was different this time. Emma could see it in the way the townspeople moved, in how they gathered in small groups to talk, in the quiet determination that had replaced their earlier fear. Hawkins might have arrived as a mysterious stranger, but his steady presence had become a rallying point for the community's courage. That evening, As shadows lengthened across Shadow Valley, Cole Watson and his men finally pushed too far. The Abbas confrontation at the saloon had escalated, with old Jake Thompson refusing to back down from his integrity despite their threats. When Frank Martinez, one of Reeves's most brutal enforcers, drew his gun, something extraordinary happened. A single shot rang out so fast that few saw where it came from. Martinez's gun went flying, his hand stinging, but unharmed. In the suddenly silent saloon, William Hawkins stood in the doorway, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the Colt revolver that had appeared in his hand as if by magic. Might want to reconsider. "Your approach, Mr. Martinez," Hawkins said mildly, his gun disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "Threatening honest men isn't as safe as it used to be in this valley." The implications of that moment rippled through Shadow Valley like waves in a pond. The mysterious old cowboy had shown just a glimpse of what he was capable of, and in doing so had changed the entire dynamic of the coming conflict. Watson and his men rode out that night, carrying more than just bruised pride. They carried the first seeds of doubt about what they were really facing in Shadow Valley. And William Hawkins, watching them go with those sharp eyes that missed nothing, knew that the real test was still to come. The days following the saloon incident brought changes to Shadow Valley that few could have predicted. Word of how an old cowboy had outdrawn one of Reeves's most feared gunmen spread through the territory like wildfire. But it wasn't just the speed of Hawkins's draw that got people talking. It was the precision, the control, the way he had disarmed, without harming. But those who watched closely, like young Sam Lancaster, began to notice other changes. The way Hawkins moved through town had shifted subtly, each step measured, each position carefully chosen. He spent more time talking with townspeople, especially those with particular skills or knowledge of the valley. One morning, Sam found him deep in conversation with old Jake Thompson, discussing more than just horses. "Show me again," Hawkins was saying, exactly where those old mining trails cut through the North Ridge. Thompson's weathered fingers traced lines on a crude map spread across his stable's workbench. 3 main passes, but only 2 that horses can manage. The third's too steep, been abandoned since the silver played out 10 years back. Hawkins nodded, his eyes holding that distant look that meant he was seeing more than just what was in front of him. "And the old mine shafts? The ones that worried you when we talked last week?" "Scattered through the whole ridge system. Some go deep, connect to natural caves. Been meaning to mark them proper, warn folks away, but..." Thompson's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "You're not worried about accidents, are you?" "Let's just say it's good to know all the features of your land," Hawkins replied, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "Especially the ones others might have forgotten." Later that day, Emma found Hawkins examining the town's water supply with Doc Harrison. They weren't just checking the main creek, but every spring, every seep, every possible source of water in the valley. "Interesting setup you have here," Hawkins commented, studying the network of small dams and channels that helped regulate water flow. "Natural springs feeding into man-made channels, all carefully maintained." Doc nodded, pride evident in his voice. "Been working on it for years. Town council thought I was crazy at first, wanting to map every water source, but after the drought of 71, you did more than just map them," Hawkins interrupted gently. "You created a system, one that could be controlled, regulated." His eyes met the doctor's with quiet intensity. "One that could be defended." Emma noticed how Doc's expression changed, understanding blooming behind his wise old eyes. "You're seeing it as more than just water management, aren't you?" "Water's life out here," Hawkins replied. "Control the water, you control everything else. Reeves knows that. It's why he's pushing north. But sometimes the best defense isn't in denying resources." He paused, those sharp eyes scanning the valley. "It's in knowing how to use them in ways your enemy never expects." Sam, who had appointed himself Hawkins's unofficial shadow, noticed other preparations too. How the old cowboy spent hours riding the valley's perimeter, noting every trail, every hollow, every possible approach. How he worked with Sheriff Cole to organize regular patrols, but in patterns that seemed random unless you knew what to watch for. "It's like a web," Sam explained excitedly to his mother one evening. "Every rider covers different ground at different times, but somehow they always know where everyone else is, what they've seen." Emma had noticed, too, the way Hawkins had quietly but effectively reorganized the valley's defenses without ever seeming to give direct orders. How he'd encouraged the formation of informal groups, ranchers who rode together, shopkeepers who watched each other's businesses, families who shared resources and information. But it was Reverend Walsh who perhaps understood best what was really happening. "He's not just preparing defenses," the preacher observed one Sunday after services. "He's building community, teaching us to work together in ways we never thought to before." The truth of those words became apparent as more of Hawkins' quiet influence revealed itself. The town's younger men found themselves learning more than just patrol routes. They were being taught to read sign, to understand weather patterns, to think about how terrain could work for or against them. Even the children were included, though in ways few adults noticed at first. Sam discovered that his regular chores now included observing and reporting anything unusual he saw while doing his deliveries. Other youngsters found themselves learning similar habits, turning their natural curiosity into a network of alert eyes and ears throughout the valley. "Notice how he never tells anyone exactly what to do," Sheriff Cole commented to Emma one afternoon, watching Hawkins work with a group of ranchers on improving their shooting accuracy. "He asks questions, makes suggestions, gets people thinking. About problems in new ways," Emma nodded, understanding dawning. "He's teaching us to think like him, isn't he? To see the valley the way he does, not just as a place to live, but as a weapon," Cole finished. "Every feature, every resource, every person becoming part of something bigger, something Reeves and his gang won't expect." The sheriff's words proved prophetic when, a few days later, 2 of Reeves' scouts were found wandering in circles in the North Hills, their horses exhausted, their water gone. They'd followed what seemed to be clear trails, only to find themselves lost in a maze of box canyons and false paths. "Interesting thing about cattle," Hawkins commented mildly when they brought the men in. "When you drive them regular-like over certain routes, they create trails that look mighty appealing to folks who don't know the land. Of course, not all trails lead where you'd expect." The scouts were allowed to leave, carrying more than just wounded pride back to their boss. They carried the first real evidence that Shadow Valley wasn't going to be the easy conquest Reeves had anticipated. That somehow, in the weeks since their first threats, the scattered ranches and isolated homesteads had transformed into something else entirely, something organized, prepared, and far more dangerous than anyone had expected. As summer deepened into early autumn, tension in Shadow Valley grew thick as storm clouds gathered over the peaks. Word arrived that Victor Viper Reeves had established a main camp just 2 days' ride south, gathering his forces for what everyone knew would be the final push north. But it was the details brought by Doc Harrison's cousin, a freight driver, who'd passed near their camp that made Hawkins' eyes narrow with focused attention. "They're not just bringing men and guns," Doc reported during an emergency town meeting in the church. "They've got supply wagons, enough provisions for a lengthy siege, and something else, heavy wagons with special suspension, the kind used for moving bank safes or mining equipment." "Field guns," Hawkins said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Military surplus from the war, if I don't miss my guess. Probably 12-pounders, capable of turning buildings to splinters at 1,000 yards. The news sent a ripple of fear through the gathered townspeople. Artillery was something none of them had counted on. But those who watched Hawkins closely noticed something curious. He didn't seem surprised or particularly concerned by the revelation. "You knew they'd bring heavy weapons, didn't you?" Sheriff Cole asked later, as they walked the town's periphery in the gathering dusk. "That's why you've been having us stockpile materials in the old mine shafts," Why you insisted on building those reinforced root cellars. Hawkins nodded, those sharp eyes scanning the ridgelines with practiced care. Men like Reeves, they follow. Patterns. Each victory makes them bolder, pushes them to escalate. The guns are meant to break our spirit as much as our defenses, show us how outmatched we are. And are we? Emma asked, falling into step beside them. Outmatched, I mean? Hawkins's smile held that predator's edge they'd come to recognize. Interesting thing about artillery, Mrs. Lancaster. It's only effective if you know where to aim. And sometimes, the most dangerous position isn't the most obvious one. His words proved prophetic the next morning when Sam, doing his regular observation rounds, discovered something that changed everyone's understanding of Hawkins's preparations. The boy came racing into town, his young face flushed with excitement. "Ma! Sheriff, you got to see what Mr. Hawkins has been building up in the old mining trails." What they found, hidden in the seemingly abandoned paths of the North Ridge, was a revelation. Over the past months, Hawkins had been quietly organizing the transformation of the old mining network into something else entirely. Natural caves had been expanded, connecting passages cleared and reinforced, creating a complex system that could shelter the town's population while providing multiple escape routes. But it was more than just a refuge. Each cave entrance had been carefully positioned and disguised, while strategic firing positions had been prepared along the ridgelines. The entire valley had been mapped and marked in ways only defenders would recognize, subtle signs indicating distances, angles, and fields of fire. "Been wondering when you'd notice," Hawkins said, appearing silently behind them as they examined one of the hidden positions. "Figured it was time you saw the full scope of what we've been preparing." "This is incredible," Cole breathed, understanding dawning in his eyes. "With this system we could move unseen through the entire valley," Hawkins finished. "Appear, where needed, vanish before they can respond, make them fight shadows while we strike from positions they don't even know exist." Emma studied the careful preparations with growing appreciation. "The field guns won't matter much if they can't spot their targets, will they?" "More than that," Hawkins replied, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "Every shot they waste on empty buildings is one they can't use later. Every position they think is crucial will turn out to be a decoy. We're not just preparing to defend the valley, Mrs. Lancaster. We're preparing to make them defeat themselves." The revelation of Hawkins's hidden preparations sparked a new wave of activity in Shadow Valley. The remaining days before Reeves' expected arrival saw the entire community working together with renewed purpose, each person now understanding their role in the larger strategy. Old Jake Thompson organized teams to move vital supplies into the cave network, while Doc Harrison established multiple aid stations, carefully hidden but easily accessible to those who knew the signs. Even Martha Bennett, the schoolteacher, found herself teaching the children special signals and safe routes that could be used to carry messages throughout the valley. But it was young Sam who perhaps best understood the genius of what Hawkins had created. "It's like that chess game you taught me," he told the old cowboy one evening as they checked the warning signals on the South Ridge. "Every piece has its purpose, but it's how they work together that matters." Hawkins nodded approvingly. "Smart boy. And like in chess, sometimes the pieces that seem least important turn out to be the ones that decide the game. Every person in this valley has a part to play, Sam. Every skill, every bit of knowledge, every pair of eyes watching and ears listening, they're all part of the defense." As the sun set that evening, painting the western peaks in shades of gold and crimson, Emma found Hawkins at his ranch, carefully checking his revolver with practiced hands. For the first time, she saw the weapon clearly. An old Colt, well worn, but meticulously maintained, with notches on the grip that spoke of stories none of them had heard. "It's all been leading to this, hasn't it?" she asked quietly. "Everything you've done since arriving, you were preparing for this moment." Hawkins carefully holstered the gun, his movements carrying that fluid grace that had nothing to do with being an old rancher. Sometimes, Mrs. Lancaster, the best way to win a fight isn't to be stronger or faster than your enemy. It's to be more patient, to prepare so thoroughly that by the time they realize what they're really facing, it's already too late. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Victor Reeves's advance party had been spotted crossing the South Meadow, led by his brother Jed, the butcher himself. But what caught everyone's attention wasn't their approach. It was their confusion. "They've been riding in circles for hours," Sam reported excitedly from his observation post in the church tower. "Following those false trails Mr. Hawkins had us create, just like he said they would." Sheriff Cole, watching through his spyglass, nodded grimly. 12 riders, all heavily armed. They're trying to scout our defenses, but the valley isn't cooperating," Hawkins finished, appearing silently behind them. He'd been up since before dawn, checking every aspect of their preparations one final time. "Notice how they keep splitting up, trying different routes. That's frustrating. Men who are used to having their way don't handle confusion well." Emma, who'd brought coffee to the watchers, noticed something in Hawkins's manner. A coiled readiness, like a mountain lion preparing to pounce. "They'll figure it out eventually, won't they?" "Course they will," Hawkins replied, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "Question is, what will it cost them before they do?" The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Jed Reeves, notorious for his short temper, finally lost patience with the deceptive terrain. He ordered his men to split into smaller groups, each taking a different approach to the town. It was exactly what Hawkins had been waiting for. "Time to show them what they're really facing," he said quietly. "Sam, give the signal." The boy raised a red bandana, waving it 3 times. Across the valley, hidden watchers began their carefully rehearsed responses. The first group of riders, following what seemed to be a clear trail along the creek, suddenly found themselves cut off as hidden gates channeled their horses into a narrow box canyon. The second group, trying to circle wide around the eastern ridge, discovered that the promising path they'd chosen led straight into a dead end, where steep cliffs made turning around nearly impossible. But it was the third group, led by Jed himself, that faced the most startling reception. As they approached what appeared to be an unguarded stretch of open ground, the earth itself seemed to turn against them. Carefully prepared slides of loose shale, triggered by hidden ropes, sent their horses scrambling for footing. Well-placed shots, aimed not to kill but to create chaos, echoed from multiple directions, making it impossible to tell how many defenders they faced. "That's right," Hawkins murmured, watching through Doc's borrowed spyglass. "Show them that every piece of ground, every rock and tree, is part of our defense." The confusion and frustration in the raiders' camp was palpable. Jed Reeves' voice carried clearly in the morning air, his curses painting the sky blue as he tried to reorganize his scattered men. "Shoot to kill," he bellowed. "Burn them out. Show these farmers what happens when they resist." But his men's answering. Fire disappeared harmlessly into empty landscape, while more carefully placed shots from hidden defenders continued to create havoc among their ranks. Horses spooked, men dove for cover that turned out to be illusory, and the very ground seemed to work against every move they made. "Notice something?" Hawkins asked Sam, who watched the unfolding chaos with keen interest. "About how they're responding." The boy studied the scene carefully, applying the lessons Hawkins had taught him over the past months. They keep looking for someone to shoot at, keep trying to fight the way they're used to. That's right. Men like that, they understand. Direct confrontation. Show them a target, they know what to do. But make them fight shadows. His voice trailed off as another series of strategically placed shots sent Jed's men scrambling for new positions. Emma, watching from the relative safety of the church, saw something else. They're not just getting confused, are they? They're getting scared. Hawkins nodded approvingly. Fear's a strange thing, Mrs. Lancaster. Men who live by causing it often don't know how to handle it themselves. Watch their hands. See how they're getting jerky, uncertain. That's what happens when bullies face something they don't understand. The morning wore on, and the frustration in Reeves' advance party turned to real concern. They'd lost 3 horses to the treacherous terrain, had men trapped in positions they couldn't easily escape from, and hadn't managed to land a single, effective shot against their invisible opponents. Finally, Jed Reeves had had enough. "Fall back!" he shouted, his voice carrying an edge of panic that none of his men had ever heard before. "Regroup at the South Meadow." But even their retreat had been anticipated. The seemingly clear path they chose for withdrawal suddenly revealed new obstacles. Fallen trees that hadn't been there earlier, streams that had mysteriously changed course, and more of those precision shots that kept them moving exactly where Hawkins wanted them to go. "They're running," Sam announced excitedly. "We've beaten them." "No," Hawkins corrected gently. "We've taught them something. This was just the first lesson. The real fight's still coming." Sheriff Cole nodded grimly. "When Victor hears about this, he'll come himself," Hawkins finished. "Come with everything he's got, trying to prove his brother's failure was a fluke. Men like that, they can't stand the thought that someone might not fear them." As they watched the demoralized raiders retreat, Emma noticed something in Hawkins' expression. Not triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd seen his careful plans unfold exactly as expected. "You knew," she said softly. "Knew they'd send Jed first, knew exactly how he'd react to the confusion. Men like the Reeves brothers, they're predictable if you understand what drives them," Hawkins replied, his eyes still tracking the retreating riders. "Jed's always been the hot-headed one, quick to violence, quicker to frustration. By letting him spring our simpler traps, we've set the stage for what's coming." "And what is coming?" Sam asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Hawkins' smile held. That predator's edge they'd come to know. "Victor Reeves is about to learn what his brother learned today, that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who fights you directly, but the one who makes every piece of ground, every gust of wind, every shadow into a weapon. And he's going to learn it the hard way." The aftermath of Jed Reeves's failed scouting mission brought changes to Shadow Valley that few could have predicted. Word of how a small town had outmaneuvered the notorious Butcher spread through the territory like wildfire, but it wasn't just the victory that got people talking. It was how it had been achieved without a single death on either side. But those who watched closely, like Doc Harrison, saw something else in the days that followed. The way Hawkins moved through town had changed subtly, his attention focused on details that others might have missed. He spent long hours with Sheriff Cole, discussing things that made the lawman's face grow increasingly grave. "You're sure about this?" Cole asked one evening, studying a crude map spread across his office desk. "All of it?" Hawkins nodded, those sharp eyes focused on the paper before them. "Victor won't take his brother's humiliation lightly. When he comes, he'll bring everything he has, not just men and guns, but a need to make an example of us." "The field guns," Emma said softly from where she stood near the door. She'd brought coffee to the men, but found herself drawn into their discussion. "He'll use them to destroy the town, won't he? Show everyone what happens to those who resist." "That's his pattern," Hawkins agreed, his voice carrying that quiet certainty they'd come to trust. "But patterns work both ways. Sometimes knowing what your enemy will do is more valuable than knowing what they can do." Young Sam, who had appointed himself, Hawkins' permanent shadow, noticed other preparations taking shape. The old caves they'd prepared weren't just being stocked with supplies anymore. They were being transformed into something else entirely. "Look here," Hawkins showed him one morning, indicating subtle marks carved into the cave walls. "What do you see?" Sam studied the marks carefully, applying the lessons he'd learned over the past months. "They're measurements? Like the ones we used for the fence posts?" "Smart boy. Every mark, every position we've prepared, they're all part of something bigger. Something Victor Reeves won't understand until it's too late." The truth of those words became apparent as more of Hawkins' deeper strategy revealed. itself. The town's younger men found themselves learning more than just defensive positions. They were being taught to think about angles, trajectories, how terrain could channel not just movement, but sound itself. Interesting thing about artillery, Hawkins explained to a group gathered in the church one evening. It's not just about power or range. It's about knowing where to place your guns, how to read the land. And sometimes, that ghost of a smile played around his lips. The worst position isn't the most obvious one. But it was Martha Bennett, the schoolteacher, who perhaps understood best what was really happening. "You're not just preparing us for a siege," she observed, watching Hawkins work with some of the older children on message routes. "You're teaching us to think differently about everything, about how we see our own valley." Hawkins nodded approvingly. "The strongest defense isn't in walls or weapons, Miss Bennett. It's in understanding, really understanding, every feature of your ground, every advantage it offers. And sometimes," he paused, those weathered hands moving with practiced care as he adjusted a signal mirror, "the best advantage is the one your enemy gives you himself." The next few days saw frantic activity throughout Shadow Valley. Under Hawkins' quiet guidance, the community transformed itself further. Every building was subtly modified, every apparent weakness carefully prepared. But it was more than just physical changes. The people themselves were changing, growing more confident as they understood the full scope of what they were part of. "Notice how he never tells anyone exactly what to do," old Jake Thompson commented to Emma one afternoon, watching Hawkins work with a group of ranchers on what seemed to be simple repair work. "He asks questions, makes suggestions, gets folks thinking about problems in ways they never considered before." Emma nodded, understanding dawning. "He's not just teaching us to defend ourselves, is he? He's teaching us to think like him, to see opportunities where others might see obstacles." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of urgent news. One of their outriders had spotted Victor Reeves's main force moving north, and the details made even Hawkins's eyes narrow, with focused attention. "At least 40 riders," the messenger reported, "with 6 supply wagons and—" He hesitated, glancing at Hawkins. "4 of those special wagons you warned us about." 4 field guns, Hawkins mused, his voice carrying that deadly calm they'd come to recognize. "More than I expected. He's not just angry, he's scared." "Scared?" Sam asked, surprised. "But he's the one with all the men and guns." "That's right." Hawkins knelt down to the boy's level, his voice taking on that teaching tone. "And that's exactly why he's scared. Men like Victor Reeves, they understand power, raw force, intimidation, the ability to destroy. But what happened to his brother showed him something he doesn't understand, something that threatens everything he believes about how the world works." "What's that?" "That sometimes the strongest force isn't the one that fights hardest, but the one that fights smartest. That a community working together, really together, can be more powerful than any gang of bullies." As evening approached, Hawkins gathered the town's key defenders in the church for final instructions. Every position had been prepared, every role carefully defined, but there was something else in his manner now, a focused intensity that reminded Emma of a mountain lion preparing to pounce. "Remember," he told them, his voice carrying to every corner of the building, "what's coming isn't just about defending our homes. It's about showing every would-be tyrant in the territory that there are some things that can't be taken by force, some spirits that won't be broken by fear." As the meeting dispersed, Sheriff Cole held back, waiting until the others had left before speaking. "There's something else, isn't there? Something you haven't told us about what's really coming." Hawkins's smile held that predator's edge they'd come to know. "Victor Reeves isn't just coming to fight us, Sheriff. He's riding into a lesson about the true nature of power, one that's been waiting to be taught since long before I arrived in Shadow Valley." Dawn painted the western peaks in shades of blood red when Sam Lancaster spotted the dust cloud rising from the south. Victor Reeves's army was moving, but what caught the boys' attention wasn't their approach. It was how Hawkins reacted to The news. Interesting timing, the old cowboy mused, studying the horizon with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. Moving in with the sun behind them, thinking to blind any lookouts. Smart, but predictable. Sheriff Cole, joining them at the church tower observation post, shared a concerned look with Emma. 40-plus riders, 4 field guns. Those are long odds, even with all our preparations. Numbers can lie, Sheriff, Hawkins replied. That, ghost of a smile playing around his lips. Just like appearances. Notice how they're moving, keeping to the high ground, trying to stay visible. They want us to see them, Sam realized, applying the lessons he'd learned over the past months. Want us to know how many they are. Smart boy. Victor's not just bringing men and guns. He's bringing fear itself, trying to break our spirit before the first shot's fired. Hawkins turned to Emma, his voice gentling. That's how he's always worked. Fear's been his true weapon, far more than any gun. But as they watched the approaching force, something unusual caught their attention. The raiders weren't moving directly toward town. Instead, they were spreading out, establishing positions on the surrounding ridges where their field guns would command the valley. They're being cautious, Cole observed. After what happened to Jed's group, more than cautious, Hawkins corrected. Look at their positions. Everyone chosen for maximum visibility, maximum effect. Victor wants to make sure everyone, for 50 miles, sees what happens to those who resist him. The morning wore on, and the tension in Shadow Valley grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Victor's men continued their careful deployment, setting up their artillery with professional precision. But those who watched closely, like Doc Harrison, noticed something curious about their positions. They're exactly where you said they'd be, the doctor commented to Hawkins as they checked the hidden aid stations one final time. Every gun, every group of riders. It's like they're following a script you wrote months ago. Hawkins nodded, his weathered hands moving with practiced care as he adjusted a signal mirror. Men like Reeves, they think they're unpredictable because they're ruthless. Never realize that their very ruthlessness makes them predictable, makes them choose the positions that look strongest, never questioning if strong is the same as smart. The first message from the raiders arrived at noon, carried by Cole Watson under a white flag. The banker's face showed strain as he delivered Victor's ultimatum to the hastily gathered town council. Mr. Reeves is prepared to be reasonable, Watson announced, his voice carrying false concern. Surrender now. Sign over your water rights and property deeds, and he'll let you leave with your lives and portable belongings. Resist. He paused for effect. And he'll make an example of Shadow Valley that the territory will never forget. The council chamber erupted in angry mutters, but all eyes turned to Hawkins, who had remained quietly in the background. The old cowboy studied Watson with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense. Interesting choice of words, he said finally, his voice carrying that deadly calm they'd come to recognize. Making examples. Tell me, Mr. Watson, in all the valleys. Reeves has taken all the lives he's ruined. Has anyone ever made an example of him? Watson's face darkened. Is that your answer, then? Defiance in the face of overwhelming force. No, Hawkins replied, that predator's smile touching his lips. My answer is a question. Has your boss figured out yet why I let his brother's group escape? Why did I let him deploy his men and guns exactly where he wanted them? The banker's composure cracked slightly. Let us? We have 40 armed riders and 4 field guns. We don't need your permission for anything. That's where you're wrong, Hawkins said softly. Everything that's happened since I arrived in this valley, every trail marked, every position prepared, every lesson taught, it's all been leading to this moment. Victor thinks he's surrounding us? He's really surrounding himself. As Watson rode back to deliver their refusal, Emma found Hawkins checking his old Colt one final time. For the first time, she saw the weapon clearly. noticed the worn grip, the carefully maintained mechanism, the subtle marks that spoke of long use and perfect familiarity. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked quietly. "Set up situations like this, I mean." Hawkins' hands moved over the revolver with practiced care. "Back when I wore a badge, I learned something important. Sometimes the best way to stop men like Reeves isn't to outfight them. It's to let them walk into a situation where their own strength becomes their weakness." Young Sam, who had been listening nearby, couldn't contain his curiosity. "Is that why you came here, Mr. Hawkins? To stop Reeves?" The old cowboy's face softened as he looked at the boy. "Came here to retire, truth be told. But when I saw this valley, saw these people," he gestured at the town spread out below them, "saw how everything was set up just right for what needed doing. Well, sometimes a man's last job turns out to be his most important." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Shadow Valley, the community made its final preparations. Every person knew their role. Every position had been checked and rechecked. Every contingency planned for. But it was more than just physical readiness. There was a quiet confidence in the town now, a strength born of understanding exactly what they were part of. "Look at them," Sheriff Cole said softly, watching the townspeople move with purposeful efficiency. 3 months ago, they were scared of rabbits. Now there's something else entirely," Hawkins finished. "Something Victor Reeves doesn't understand and never will. A community that's learned to think as one, move as one, turn every feature of their valley into a weapon. And tomorrow," his eyes held that focused intensity that reminded Emma of a mountain lion preparing to pounce. "Tomorrow they're going to teach him exactly what that means." The first light of dawn hadn't yet touched the eastern peaks when Victor Reeves made his opening move. The boom of field guns shattered the pre-dawn silence, sending shells screaming toward Shadow Valley. But what happened next wasn't what anyone expected, least of all the raiders. The shells exploded harmlessly in empty fields or smashed into buildings that had been carefully prepared and evacuated. When the smoke cleared, the town appeared devastated, but those watching closely might have noticed something odd about the destruction. "Notice anything?" Hawkins asked Sam, who watched from their hidden position in the old mine workings. "About where the shells are landing." The boy studied the pattern of impacts carefully, applying the lessons of the past months. They're hitting exactly where you said they would, where we prepared the ground." "That's right. Victor's using the most obvious firing positions, choosing the targets that look most important. Never occurred to him that we might want him to hit certain places." Emma, who had insisted on staying with them despite the danger, saw something else. "The town looks destroyed, but all the real damage is to empty buildings and prepared positions," Hawkins finished. "Meanwhile, our people are safe in the cave network, and every shot they waste tells us more about their guns' exact positions." The artillery barrage continued for nearly an hour, with Reeves' men methodically reducing what they thought were Shadow Valley's key structures to rubble. When it finally stopped, Victor's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "That was just a taste," he shouted. "Surrender now, or the next barrage won't be aimed at buildings." Instead of the panic he expected, his threat was met with an eerie silence. No screams, no chaos, no terrified townspeople running for safety. Just the quiet morning breeze carrying dust from the demolished structures. "Something's wrong," they heard Jed Reeves say, his voice carrying an edge of worry. "There should be more movement, more—" "Shut up." Victor's authority cracked like a whip. "They're hiding, that's all. Send in the first wave. Flush them out." But as his riders moved down into the valley, Hawkins's carefully laid plans began to unfold. The seemingly random destruction had created a maze of debris and rubble, channeling the raiders' approach along specific routes. Routes that had been prepared months in advance. "Watch carefully," Hawkins told Sam, his voice carrying that teaching tone even now. "Remember what we discussed about horses and the way they move? The first sign that something was wrong came when the lead riders tried to cut through what looked like a clear path between two collapsed buildings. Their horses suddenly balked, refusing to move forward despite their riders' urging. "Horse sense," Hawkins explained quietly. "They can smell the coal oil we've soaked into certain areas. Won't go near it unless they're forced, and forcing them takes time they don't have." As if to prove his point, carefully placed shots began ringing out from multiple directions. None aimed to kill, but each striking with surgical precision, unseating riders, spooking horses, creating chaos in the raiders' formation. "That's right," Hawkins murmured, watching through his spyglass. "Bunch up, try to find cover that isn't there. Show us exactly where you are." Victor's voice rose above the confusion, trying to restore order. "The shots are coming from the North Ridge. Get those guns repositioned." "Common mistake," Hawkins commented to Sheriff Cole, who monitored the action from another viewpoint. Thinking, "All the shots are coming from where the sound seems to be coming from. Sound does funny things in valleys like this. Bounces off walls, echoes in ways that confuse those who don't know the land." The field guns began to pivot, their crews struggling to redirect the heavy weapons toward the perceived threat. But this too had been anticipated. The moment they started to move, hidden defenders triggered the next phase of Hawkins's plan. Carefully prepared charges, set beneath certain key positions, detonated with controlled force. Not enough to kill, but more than sufficient to send men and horses scrambling for safety that didn't exist. "You planned this," Emma realized, watching the chaos unfold. "Every shot, every explosion, it's all driving them exactly where you want them." "Men like Reeves," Hawkins replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm. "They're used to being the ones causing chaos, creating fear. Turn that back on them, make them face confusion and uncertainty, and they start making mistakes." The morning wore on, and the raiders' frustration turned to real concern. Every attempt to establish new positions was met with precise fire from unexpected directions. Every seemingly safe approach turned into a trap. Even their vaunted field guns had become more liability than asset, as moving them through the maze of debris and prepared obstacles proved nearly impossible. "Brother!" Jed's voice carried an edge of panic now. "We need to pull back, regroup. This isn't right. They're playing with us." "No." Victor's rage was palpable. "I won't be made a fool of by some washed-up old man and a bunch of farmers. Bring up the reserve ammunition. We'll level every inch of this valley if we have to." "Interesting choice," Hawkins mused, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "Notice how the ground's getting softer when they're trying to move those." "Heavy ammunition wagons?" Sam's eyes widened with understanding. "The irrigation ditches, the ones we've been flooding for the past 3 days. Smart boy. Amazing what a little water can do to seemingly solid ground, especially when you've spent months preparing it just right." As if on cue, one of the ammunition wagons suddenly tilted, its wheels sinking into what had appeared to be firm earth. The crash of shells falling, followed by panic-stricken shouts, told its own story. "Time for the next phase," Hawkins said quietly, checking his old Colt one final time. "Remember what I told you about patterns, Sam? About how men like Reeves always follow them, even when they think they're being unpredictable?" "Yes, sir." "You said their strength becomes their weakness if you understand how they think." "That's right. And right now, Victor Reeves is about to learn just how predictable he's been, just how completely his own patterns have trapped him in a web that's been waiting since before he ever thought of moving north." As the morning sun climbed higher, over Shadow Valley, Victor Reeves's carefully planned assault had descended into chaos. His men, scattered and confused by the defenders' precise fire and carefully prepared traps, had lost all semblance of coordinated action. But it was the field guns, their supposed trump card, that had become their biggest liability. "Look there," Hawkins pointed out to Sam, indicating where one of the heavy weapons had become hopelessly mired in the softened ground. "Remember what I told you about turning strength into weakness?" The boy nodded eagerly. "The bigger and stronger something is, The harder it falls, Hawkins finished. Those guns need solid ground and clear lines of fire to be effective. Take those away, and they become anchors dragging their own men down. Emma, watching from their hidden position, saw something change in Hawkins' manner. The quiet rancher was fading, replaced by something else, something that reminded her of a mountain lion preparing for the final pounce. "It's time, isn't it?" she asked softly. Hawkins checked his old Colt one final time, those weathered hands moving with practiced precision. "Victor's about to make his last mistake, the one I've been waiting for since I first arrived in this valley." As if on cue, Reeves's voice carried across the morning air, edged with desperation and rage. "Enough of these games, Hawkins! Show yourself, you coward! Face me like a man!" Interesting choice of words, Hawkins murmured, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. Coward! Coming from a man who's built his empire on threatening those weaker than himself. He turned to Sheriff Cole, who had joined them in their observation post. "Remember what I told you about patterns? About how men like Reeves always follow them, even when they think they're being unpredictable?" Cole nodded grimly. "You said his pride would make him challenge you directly once everything else failed." "That's right. And when he does..." Hawkins's eyes held that focused intensity they'd come to know. "He'll be standing exactly where 3 months of preparation says he needs to be." Moving with that fluid grace that had nothing to do with being an old rancher, Hawkins began making his way down toward the town's main street. But his path wasn't direct. He moved through a series of positions that Sam realized had been carefully prepared months in advance. "Just like the fence posts," the boy whispered excitedly to his mother. "Every step, every position, he's been practicing this moment since he first arrived." Victor Reeves stood in the middle of the debris-strewn street, his expensive clothes dusty from the morning's chaos. His gun belt rode low, tied down for fast draw, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man used to solving problems with violence. "Finally decided to face me, old man?" he called out, watching Hawkins approach. "No more tricks, no more traps?" "Interesting assumptions," Hawkins replied, his voice carrying that same calm it had held while teaching Sam about horses and fence posts. "Thinking that facing you means doing it your way. That's always been your weakness, Victor. Believing that power only works in one direction. I've got 30 men still able to fight," Reeves snarled, "and enough ammunition to turn this valley into a graveyard. You've lost everything, your precious town's in ruins." "Have I?" Hawkins's smile held that predator's edge they'd come to know. "Look around you. Really look. Every building that's been destroyed was empty, prepared to fall exactly how we wanted. Every position your men hold was chosen for them, shaped by months of careful preparation. Even where you're standing right now." Something in his tone made Reeves glance down, suddenly uncertain. "That's right," Hawkins continued, still moving with measured precision. "You're standing exactly where I've wanted you since the day I arrived. Everything that's happened, every shot fired, every trap sprung, it's all been leading to this moment." "You're lying." But there was fear in Reeves's voice now. "No one could plan something like this. Remember Colorado?" Hawkins asked quietly. 15 years ago, when you were just starting out? There was a marshal then, one they called the Ghost of Laramie. Not because he killed men, but because he had a way of appearing exactly where trouble was brewing, always one step ahead of the violence." Reeves's face went pale. "That's just a story. A legend mothers use to scare their children." "Is it? Ask your brother about Sonora, about how his gun hand got crippled by a single shot that seemed to come from nowhere. Ask him about the marshal who spent 6 months preparing an entire town to resist men just like you." Understanding dawned in Reeves's eyes, followed quickly by real fear. You're him? The ghost?" "Names don't matter much," Hawkins replied, still moving with that careful precision. "What matters is what a man chooses to do with his skills, his experience. Sometimes the best way to stop men like you isn't to hunt them down, It's to show others how to stand against them. Doesn't matter who you are. Reeves's hand drifted toward his gun. You're still just one man. That's where you're wrong again. Hawkins gestured at the surrounding buildings, where dozens of townspeople had emerged from hiding, each holding carefully aimed rifles. I'm every person in this valley who helped prepare what you've experienced. Every trap, every shot, every bit of confusion. It's all been created by the very people you thought would be easy prey. The moment stretched like a drawn bowstring, tension building in the morning air. Everyone could see the calculation in Reeves's eyes, weighing his speed against Hawkins, measuring his chances. They say you never miss, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Never have, Hawkins agreed quietly. But here's something else to consider. That gun you're thinking of drawing? I adjusted its sights while you were sleeping in your camp last night. Moved them just a fraction of an inch, enough to make any shot go wild. The color drained from Reeves's face. Impossible, is it? Check the grip. You'll find a small scratch, right where your thumb rests. Proof that some ghosts are very real indeed. With trembling hands, Reeves drew his revolver. Not to fire, but to check. There, exactly where Hawkins had described, was a fresh scratch in the pearl grip. The gun slipped from nerveless fingers, falling to the dust of the street. The days following Victor Reeves's surrender brought changes to Shadow Valley that few could have predicted. The Snake River Gang, seeing their invincible leader disarmed not by violence but by careful preparation and quiet wisdom, began to dissolve, like morning mist under the rising sun. But it was more than just the end of their reign of terror. It was the beginning of something new. Word spread through the territory like wildfire, but not just about how an old lawman had outmaneuvered the notorious Victor Reeves. The real story, the one that grew stronger with each telling, was about how one man had taught an entire community to stand together against fear itself. You know what I finally understood, Sam said one morning, helping Hawkins repair his fence. Fine? When you first came here, everyone thought you were just an old cowboy pretending to be something more. But really, you were a lawman learning to be something better. Hawkins's smile held approval for his young student's insight. The fastest gun can only solve one problem at a time, he said softly. But an idea, a way of thinking that shows people how to stand together, how to prepare and support each other, that can solve problems for generations to come. Emma found him on his porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the valley in familiar shades of promise. Will they come back? She asked quietly. Others like Reeves? Probably, Hawkins admitted, cleaning his old Colt with the same careful precision he showed in everything. Evil has a way of trying to reclaim ground it's lost. But this valley's different now. These people are different. He gestured at the town where lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. They've learned that the strongest defense isn't in how fast you can draw a gun, but in how deeply you've planted your roots in the community around you. The changes in Shadow Valley rippled outward like waves in a pond. Other towns began adopting their methods, learning that the best way to fight lawlessness wasn't just with badges and guns, but with carefully prepared communities that stood together against threats. The defeat of the Snake River Gang became more than just another frontier tale. It became a blueprint for how good people could stand against evil without losing their own goodness in the process. Sheriff Cole found Hawkins at his ranch the next morning, the territorial marshal's badge gleaming in his hand. "Governor sent this," he said quietly. "Says we need men like you wearing the law's star." But Hawkins simply shook his head, that ghost of a smile playing around his lips. "With respect, Sheriff, I can do more good right here. Not just raising horses, but helping grow ideas about how people can protect themselves without becoming what they're fighting against." The territorial governor himself rode out to see what had changed in this once vulnerable town. What he found wasn't just a community that had learned to defend itself, but a model for how other settlements could stand against the lawlessness that plagued the frontier. "You've certainly grown something remarkable here," the governor observed, looking around at the transformed town. "The soil was good," Hawkins replied, using the farmer's metaphors that had become his trademark. These people just needed someone to show them how to tend it properly. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Shadow Valley continued to transform. The old church, once a symbol of hope against harsh odds, became a school where Hawkins taught not just riding and shooting, but the principles of preparation and community defense that had saved the town. Sam proved an especially apt pupil, absorbing not just the physical skills Hawkins taught, but the deeper wisdom behind them. "It's like you said about the fence posts," the boy commented one day, helping set up targets for the younger children's practice. "Everything serves two purposes, protection and growth." "That's right," Hawkins agreed, watching as former raiders worked alongside townspeople to strengthen the community's defenses. The strongest barrier against evil isn't a wall or a gun. It's people working together, supporting each other, turning their differences into strengths. Visitors began arriving in Shadow Valley, lawmen, community leaders, and yes, even reformed outlaws, all wanting to learn how one small town had defeated the most sophisticated gang in the territory. But what they found was something more valuable than tactical knowledge. They found a new way of thinking about strength and community. "You've started something bigger than just protecting one town, haven't you?" Emma observed one evening, watching Hawkins teach a group of visitors about using terrain and weather to their advantage. "Every seed planted grows beyond its original boundaries, Mrs. Lancaster," Hawkins replied. "What we did here, what we built, it's like a healthy crop. It spreads, takes root in new soil, grows into something bigger than what was first planted." As winter settled over Shadow Valley, bringing with it a peace that felt earned rather than borrowed, the legend of the lawman who became a teacher continued to grow. But those who had been there, who had watched his patient preparation unfold, knew the real story wasn't about speed with a gun or tactical brilliance. It was about how one man had shown an entire community that the strongest power isn't in the ability to deal death, but in the patience to nurture life and grow something worth protecting. The fence posts still stood exactly where Hawkins had placed them, measuring out more than just property lines now. They stood as silent reminders that sometimes the deadliest force isn't the fastest draw or the biggest gang, but the quiet man who knows how to turn patience into power and community into an unbreakable shield against fear. And in that lesson, Shadow Valley had found not just safety, but a new way of living that would endure long after the tale of its defender had passed into legend. For in the end, they had learned that true strength isn't measured by the speed of a draw or the size of a gang, but by the depth of roots planted in soil, made rich by wisdom, courage, and the unshakable bonds of community. "Remember this," Hawkins told Sam on that final evening as they watched the sun set behind the western peaks. "The fastest gun can only protect what's in front of it. But wisdom, preparation, and a community standing together, that can protect everything that matters, for as long as people remember the lesson." In the gathering dusk, Shadow Valley's lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, each one a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won by the fastest gun, but by the most patient heart. And in that truth, they had found something more precious than safety. They had found a legacy that would light the way for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.